Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this book launch event hosted by the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society. My name is Mark Pennington. I'm the director of the centre. So, we're living in a time when people are on the move, whether because of wars, economic hardships, natural disasters, whether genuinely natural or human-induced. And this raises important questions about the value of the movement of people. Sometimes people present the idea of people moving to escape problems as some kind of a bad thing. But perhaps there are other ways to think about the movement of people. And it's in that context that I'm very pleased that we have with us today Professor Ilya Somin, who's going to be launching his new book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration and Political Freedom, which is published by Oxford University Press. Ilya is Professor of Law at George Mason University in the United States. So please welcome Professor Ilya Somin.
Thank you so much. We actually published the original edition of this book back in April of 2020. Ironically, a book about the value of freedom of movement came out just as much of the world, including this country, of course, were going into lockdown. It is my hope that if anything good at all comes out of the horror that we have all lived through with the COVID pandemic, it may be a new appreciation for the value of freedom of movement. So obviously, my original book launching events, if you want to call them that, back in April of 2020 were mostly canceled, though I did some things online, and the book did come out. However, I and the publisher thought there's a whole bunch of issues related to freedom of movement that have either come up during the pandemic or their importance was highlighted by its occurrence, and therefore we put out a new revised edition of the book much sooner than I at least originally expected would occur. And in fact, the new edition came out just a few months ago, and it includes a number of additional topics such as the pandemic, the implications of remote work for freedom of movement and for voting with your feet, and a number of other new issues as well. So I'm very happy to be here to present the new and I hope even more exciting edition of Free to Move. The book focuses on the benefits of voting with your feet as a method of choosing what government policies you want to live under. And there are three major types of foot voting that I talk about in the book. One is probably the most familiar type, which is foot voting in a federal system like what we have in the United States, or what you in the UK to some degree have with England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So you can choose what local or regional government to live in part based on its government policies. There can also be foot voting in the private sector. As I'll discuss, there's a lot of private sector institutions that fulfill functions traditionally associated with regional or local government, and those also can be mechanisms of voting with your feet. And finally, there's the most controversial type, foot voting through international migration, which we'll also spend a good deal of time on. There are, of course, a variety of objections to expanding foot voting rights, and I'll talk about them in the latter part of the presentation. I'll also briefly mention how it is possible to set up both domestic political institutions and international law in ways that expand people's opportunities to vote with their feet while also mitigating potential downsides. But first things first, why would we even think of foot voting as a mechanism of political choice when most people would say the way we choose our government policies is at the ballot box, like when Americans vote in our presidential elections, or Britain, like in 2019, has parliamentary elections, and so forth. So if we can choose our government policies at the ballot box, why would we need foot voting? And I think ballot box voting has important advantages, but it also has, relative to foot voting, two major disadvantages. One of them is that when you vote at the ballot box, the chance that your vote will make a difference is infinitesimally small. In an American presidential election, you have about a 1 in 60 million chance that your vote will be decisive. If you live in a swing state, like I sort of do in Virginia, your chances will be a little bit higher. If you live in a non-swing state, they can be even lower. Obviously, if you live in Britain, you have a somewhat greater chance of casting a decisive vote in a British national election because Britain's electorate is smaller, but it's still one chance in many millions. In most cases, we would not say that you have meaningful freedom of choice if you have only a 1 in 60 million or even a 1 in 1 million chance of making a difference to the outcome. We wouldn't say that you have meaningful freedom of speech if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine which opinions you want to express. We wouldn't say that you have meaningful freedom of religion if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to decide what faith you want to practice or whether you want to practice one at all. And similarly, I would say that you don't have much in the way of meaningful political freedom if you have only a 1 in 1 million or 1 in 60 million chance of being able to determine what government policies you are going to live under. That seems like a very low level of political freedom, if any at all. Precisely because there's so little chance that a vote will make a difference to the outcome of an election, it is also the case that most voters are what economists call rationally ignorant. That is, they devote very little time to seeking out information about the issues at stake in elections or about the opposing candidates and their platforms, because they know that even if they become very well informed, the chance that that knowledge will make a difference is extremely small. And both in the United States and in the UK and in countries that we have survey data for around the world, we find that most voters indeed know very little about the issues that they vote on at the ballot box. I give lots of examples in the book and even more in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance. Here I'll just give one or two. For example, only about a third to a half of Americans can even name the three branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Most people in the US and also in Britain, they have very little idea of how the central government spends its money. They massively, in both countries, underestimate the percentage that's spent on various welfare state programs and greatly overestimate the percentage that goes to foreign aid. Here in Britain, during the Brexit debate a few years ago, there was also evidence that people vastly overestimated the percentage of funding that went to the European Union, which was actually less than 1% of Britain's GDP, and overestimated various other costs associated with the EU as well. And there are many other examples of political ignorance that I could give from the United States, from Britain, and indeed from around the world. The fundamental problem is that voters have very little chance of, or very little incentive of becoming well-informed, and that leads to most of them having very little chance of doing so as well. The American Medical Association says that before a doctor can treat you or operate on you or do almost anything, they have to get your informed consent. And similarly, as we all saw during the COVID pandemic, but even during normal times, like medical decisions, public policy decisions are often literally matters of life and death. They affect people's life chances, their health care, their life prospects, and so forth. And yet, there is very little in the way of informed consent during most elections. Rather, what actually happens is that most government policies, most of the time, they're like the treatments of a doctor whose administrations you cannot refuse. And most of the people being treated, they have very little idea of whether the doctor is actually curing the disease or whether he is instead giving them snake oil that might even make the disease worse. And that, I think, is not a great state of affairs. Ballot box voting, on the other hand, is superior on both of these dimensions. When you choose where to live, and based in part on government policies, or when you make choices in the private sector, those are decisions that actually have a high probability of making a difference. And therefore, it's not a 1 in 60 million chance, it's a 1 in 1 chance, at least if you're allowed to make the choice at all. Granted, if you're married like I am, your spouse might have a say, and my wife will perhaps quite often, and for good reason, even veto decisions that I might want to make, but she will probably give me more of a hearing and more of a voice, I hope, than President Biden would or President Trump would should he come back into office, or than if I lived in Britain than Boris Johnson would. So I have a better chance of persuading her, I hope, than of persuading the U.S. government or even the state government that I live under. So you have a much better odds of actually being able to make a decision that has a decisive effect. And for that very reason, when people vote with their feet, they also seek out more information. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time seeking out relevant information the last time you decided what smartphone to get or what television set to buy than the last time you decided who to vote for in any election. That's not because your TV set or your smartphone makes more important decisions than the government of your country or that it deals with more complicated issues. It's because when you decide what TV set to buy, that decision is likely to make a difference. That TV will actually be in your living room most likely, and you'll get to watch it. But if you turn it on and you have the misfortune of seeing the President of the United States or some other politician, your odds of being able to influence who that is or what policies they adopt, those odds are infinitesimally small, and therefore you probably devote very little time and effort to seeking out information on that decision. I won't go into detail on this here, but these two advantages of foot voting over ballot box voting translate into advantages under a wide range of theories of political freedom, both right and left. So although I myself am something of a libertarian, nothing in this book depends on specifically libertarian premises. I can defend this position on a variety of general liberal premises associated with people like John Rawls or John Locke or many others, both right and left, because all of these theories, it turns out, it's better if political choice actually has a chance of making a significant difference and if it's likely to be well-informed as opposed to poorly informed. So I'd now like to take a closer look at the specific types of foot voting, and I'll start out with the most familiar, foot voting in a federal system like the one that exists in the United States and to a certain degree exists in the United Kingdom with the four nations of the British Isles. And here, potentially, there's tremendous benefits. For example, in the U.S., we have 50 state governments and many thousands of local governments, and that provides people potentially with a wide range of options, much wider than if you just, all you can do is vote for either the Democrats or the Republicans at the federal level. Here, there's a wide range of choice, and historically, both in the U.S. and many other federal systems, this choice has been especially valuable for the poor and the disadvantaged who are able to move to places with greater opportunities than they had before. In the United States, there's a long history of this. Famous examples include people moving to the West in the 19th century, getting opportunity. African Americans escaping the segregation era South to move to places which were less discriminatory and oppressive. More recently, gays and lesbians moving to places that were more tolerant of them. And there's also even a history in the U.S. and elsewhere of women moving to jurisdictions that were more accepting and tolerant of them and offered them equal rights earlier than others. The first American states to offer the vote to women were actually territories in the West, like Wyoming, which had a shortage of men at the time. The men there say, we want to be able to get married at some point in our lives, got to attract more women. So the Wyoming legislature said, we're going to give women the vote so that we can attract more of them to come here. That's just one of many historical examples of foot voting under federalism giving people more opportunities. And there are many other examples from both the United States and around the world. In recent years, in the U.S. And in Britain as well, some obstacles have arisen to internal foot voting. The biggest is restrictive zoning laws, which make it difficult to build new housing in response to demand. There are some other obstacles as well. In the book, I discuss ways to eliminate those obstacles or at least reduce them so as to make foot voting more feasible for the poor and the disadvantaged especially. It is also the case, as I mentioned earlier, that during the pandemic, we've seen the rise of remote work, and this potentially expands opportunities for foot voting under federalism because whereas before everybody or almost everybody had to live where their job is, now potentially you can live in Kansas but continue to work for your firm that's in New York City, or you can live on a remote island in Scotland but work for a firm in London, and so forth. So that expands opportunities. On the other hand, you could say this makes foot voting a bit less valuable because there's less need to vote with your feet to move to a place where you could get a better job, which is a traditional motive for moves. But I should note, while this potentially has these effects, the data show that some 80 or 90% of people in the United States and also here in the UK still do need to live relatively close to their jobs because in the case of a wide range of jobs, they still do have to work in person. Even people like me or my wife, who's a lawyer, in theory, they can work entirely remotely, but studies show that there is actually value in increasing productivity for them to interact in person with their colleagues at least some of the time. So while I think remote work can increase prospects for foot voting, our enthusiasm should be tempered by the understanding that a high percentage of the population, at least for a long time to come, still will need to live close to where they work. So there is tremendous opportunity for foot voting under federalism, and we can expand it further by decentralizing power to lower levels of government, thus subjecting more issues to foot voting. There are some objections and criticisms of foot voting under federalism that arguably they limit its effectiveness, such as fears of races to the bottom or fears that this won't work well for various minority groups. I discuss this at some length in the book, and I'm happy to take questions about those issues. But for now, I'll press on to a less familiar topic, which is foot voting in the private sector. And usually we think of political choices involving purely governmental organizations. However, both in the US and in the UK and in other countries, there are many private organizations which offer services similar to those traditionally associated with regional and local governments. The best examples are private planned communities like condominium or homeowners associations. In the United States, there are some 74 million Americans that already live in institutions like this. I don't know what the figure for the UK is, but I know they do exist in this country. They exist elsewhere in Europe and Canada as well. And they provide lots of services associated with local governments, such as various environmental amenities, sometimes education, security, trash removal, and many other things. And in some ways, this is actually even better than foot voting in a federal system because you can fit many more of these institutions in a given space than you can fit state or local governments. And the quality of services provided by these organizations, studies suggest often they're better and cheaper than those provided by governmental equivalents. So as a result, they expand a range of choice, and the quality of options is often better as well. What is true of private planned communities is also true of a variety of other private sector alternatives to the government, such as private schooling in some European countries, and in a few jurisdictions in the US, people can be given or are given vouchers where they can choose private schools instead of public schools if that's what they prefer. That expands people's range of choice and enables them to make decisions. And also, potentially, it means you can change your school or your planned community without actually moving very far, thereby reducing the moving cost problem, which can affect or limit other kinds of foot voting. The most common objection to private sector foot voting is that really this is only available to the wealthy. And in fact, the former U.S. Secretary of Labor, Robert B. Reich, he famously called this the secession of the successful. He felt that this is just wealthy people walling themselves off from everybody else. Even in the status quo, I think this isn't true. As I mentioned before, there are already 74 million Americans who live in these sorts of institutions, and we don't have 74 million very wealthy people in the US. They're wealthy by world standards, but not by American standards. That said, it is true that this form of organization on average is somewhat more available to the wealthy and the upper middle class than to others. In the book, I propose various reforms to make it more available to more people. It is still the case that there won't be perfect foot voting opportunities for everyone, either in a federal system or in the private sector, but they can be greatly expanded compared to where they are now, and more powers of government can be decentralized to the local level or even to the private sector so as to enable a wider range of choice of this kind. So it is not my claim that foot voting like this can completely displace the functions of government or that everything can be subject to it, but much more can than is currently the case. And in the book, I describe how it's possible to have greater decentralization of a wide range of issues. The most controversial type of foot voting out there is foot voting through international migration. As you probably know, there has been a significant backlash to this in the United States. It contributed greatly to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Obviously, it has occurred in the UK and in various European countries as well. It contributed to what led to Brexit. It has led to the rise of Madame Le Pen in France, Orban in Hungary, and others. Nonetheless, despite the controversy, this is the form of foot voting that has the greatest potential for gains. The reason for that is that the differences in quality of government between nations is much larger than any differences that exist within them. If you think of whatever it is that whatever part of the United Kingdom you think is best governed compared to whatever part you think is the worst governed, it's probably a big difference, but it's small compared to the difference between the UK or the US and a country like China or Cuba or Russia or North Korea and so on. So you see truly enormous contrasts between the places people leave behind and the ones they go to. There are some examples on the screen. Refugees fleeing Cuba for the United States, trading a totalitarian communist state for at least a relatively free society. Syrian refugees fleeing the horrible war and oppression there. Very recent example, Ukrainian refugees, some 6 million of them have left Ukraine. They are fleeing, obviously, Vladimir Putin's horrific invasion, and also Russians fleeing the increasing repression within Russia itself, where, among other things, you can get 15 years in prison just for referring to the war in Ukraine as a war, as opposed to a special military operation, which is the official Kremlin term for it. So these are just among the many examples of how when people are allowed to migrate freely internationally, they can often have vast increases in freedom of choice, both political freedom, but also almost every other kind of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom for repression against minorities or women fleeing patriarchal society, religious minorities who want to practice their faith freely, and so on. There are also tremendous economic gains here in that many of the people engaging in international migration, they're living in societies where, because of the oppressive and corrupt nature of the government, no matter how smart they are or how hard they work, they have almost no chance of escaping poverty. On the other hand, if they move to the US or Britain or other freer societies, they almost immediately can double or triple their productivity, and over time, those gains can become even greater as they have the opportunity to improve their skills. Economists estimate that if we had free migration throughout the world's GDP would double. That is, on average, people would be twice as productive, and it's because of enormous gains like these that many millions of people can move to places where they're essentially from places where they're essentially condemned to poverty to places where they can be much better off. So the gains here are enormous, and I will merely add that something like 1/3 or more of the world's population lives under dictatorships. for those people, foot voting through international migration is virtually their only chance of exercising any kind of meaningful political choice at all. They don't even have sort of the limited opportunities that we have at the ballot box, those of us who live in democracies. So despite these enormous potential advantages, there are all sorts of objections to migration rights, particularly international migration. I'll turn to some of them now. I divide those into two broad categories. One is arguments which say that governments have a general right to exclude people. A second is that even if they don't have a general right to exclude, maybe we need to exclude for certain particular reasons because otherwise there would be negative side effects like overburdening the welfare state, increasing crime, more recently spreading the COVID-19 virus, and so on. So I'll start first with the general right to exclude, and the most common form it takes is the kind that you see on the screen right now. The sign there, it's a French nationalist sign, says La France aux Français, France for the French. The idea here is that the ethnically French people are the true owners of France, and therefore they have the right to exclude everybody else. And similarly, you could say Italy for the Italians, Germany for the Germans, and so on. You often hear this kind of argument as a justification for immigration restrictions. In the United States, this argument is heard less often because if you take it seriously, it might lead to the idea that the Native Americans are the true owners of the land and have the right to expel all the rest of us. And so you don't hear this argument so much in my country. But even in other countries, including, yes, France, this argument has very severe problems. The most obvious and significant is that if you take it seriously, it's a rationale for racial and ethnic discrimination. Almost everyone today condemns South African apartheid, where you live depended on whether you were black or white. We also condemn racial segregation of the sort that existed in the US, same thing, where you could live depending on whether you were black or white. If we condemn this domestically, then I think there's equal reason for condemning it internationally. The international form of apartheid is no better than the domestic one. In both cases, the same ethical points are in play, in that the reason why we condemn this domestically is that ultimately your race or ethnicity, whether you're black or white or Hispanic or Asian and so on, it's first of all, it's something you can't control. It's a matter of who your parents were. You don't get to choose who they were. And second, it's a morally irrelevant characteristic. It doesn't determine how good a person you are. It doesn't determine how much freedom you should be allowed to have. If this is true within a country, it should be true internationally as well, that if race and ethnicity is something that the government should not discriminate on within countries, then things don't change merely because the people we're discriminated against were born in another country as opposed to in the one that we're currently in. And this point, I think, applies not just to explicitly racial and ethnic immigration restrictions, but even to other kinds of immigration restrictions, almost all of which, both in the US and the UK and elsewhere, they ultimately turn, at least in large part, based on who your parents were or where you were born. If you were born in the United States or your parents were American citizens, then you have a strong presumptive right to live and work in the US. If you were born anywhere outside the US and your parents were not US citizens, then you're presumptively excluded unless the US government says, well, we out of the goodness of our heart let you in. And so it's still where you were born or who your parents are that determines your fate. And this is, in fact, very much like the medieval system of feudalism, where under the medieval system, under feudalism, if you were born a noble, you could move around freely and live where you wanted. On the other hand, if you were born a serf, you could only move if your lord let you. And in most cases, of course, they wouldn't. And we readily condemn this because we say, those serfs, they didn't actually do anything wrong. All they did was they chose the wrong parents, and that's not a good reason to restrict their liberty. But if this is wrong when it was done under the feudal system, where they distinguished between the serfs and the nobles, it's wrong today also when we distinguish between the people born within the United States and the people born outside, or the people who made the mistake of choosing parents who weren't American citizens or British citizens or European Union citizens or what have you. In each case, a person's freedom is determined by an arbitrary circumstance of birth that they made the mistake of choosing the wrong parents. If we understand that this is unjust in the case of feudalism, it's equally unjust in the case of our modern form of feudalism in the form of immigration policy. So there is another form of the argument for a general right to exclude, which does not depend on parentage as much, and certainly doesn't depend on race or ethnicity. And this form of argument is common in the United States, but it occasionally crops up elsewhere. It's the idea that national governments have rights to exclude people similar to the owners of a private house or the members of a private club. So in my house, I can exclude people, and I don't necessarily have to have a good reason. Similarly, I can have a private club, and I and the other members, we can exclude new members, and we don't necessarily have to have a good reason. For example, I'm a baseball fan. I could say this is a club for my fellow baseball fans, people who are fans of other sports, including, yes, even soccer, which you call football. They're excluded, and people who are not interested in sports are excluded. It's not because non-baseball fans are worse people than baseball fans. It's just because I and my other club members, we feel like excluding them. So similarly, you could say the US or Britain or France are like a private homeowner or like a club, and therefore they can exclude people as well. There are a number of weaknesses to this argument. I go through several in the book, but here I'll just mention the most significant one. If you accept this theory, it has dire implications not just for potential immigrants, but also for natives. Recall that the owner of a private home can potentially determine what opinions can be expressed in their house or what religions can be practiced there. And the same thing goes for members of a private club. I can have a club solely for Republicans or for Democrats. I could have a Christian club or a Muslim club, and adherents of other faiths are excluded. If the powers of a national government are analogous to those of a homeowner or of members of a private club, that's essentially a justification for a virtually totalitarian state, one that can control speech, religion, and almost any other activity of the people residing under its territory. And to my mind, that's sufficient reason to reject these kinds of analogies, though in the book I give some additional reasons as well. Even if you reject the idea of a general right to exclude, there are obviously many arguments that are offered for the theory that maybe there are particular negative side effects of migration, that we have to exclude people, at least many people, in order to prevent them. I can't go through all of them in the presentation. I do, in fact, go through a large number of different ones in the book. Here, I'll just give a few examples. There's concern that immigrants will overburden the welfare state, that they'll raise crime, that they'll do things like have a negative effect on the political system or on the culture. I know it's hard to believe, but if you have too many of the wrong kinds of immigrants, they might even vote in a president of the United States who has no regard for liberal democratic values whatsoever. And if he loses an election, he denies that he has lost and incites violence to try to stay in power. It's hard to believe that that could potentially happen. Therefore, there's a range of these kinds of objections, and in the book I develop a general three-part framework for dealing with them. So there's three questions we want to ask. First, how big is this problem really? Often it will turn out that the answer is that it's not much of a problem at all. For example, far from overburdening the welfare state, both in the US and Canada and Europe, the vast majority of immigrants actually contribute more to the public coffers than they take out. Similarly, in the US and Canada, and at least some European countries, immigrants have actually a lower crime rate than natives do. That's true even for illegal immigrants. So they're not increasing increasing our crime rate, they're actually lowering it. And there's a number of other problems that are overblown as well. However, let's say there's a genuine problem. Then you have to ask the second question, which is there a keyhole solution? A keyhole solution is scholars' name for a way to mitigate or eliminate the negative side effects of migration without restricting the migration itself. For example, let's say that the evidence actually does show that immigrants are overburdening the welfare state. An obvious keyhole solution is to limit their access to welfare benefits, which in the U.S. we actually already do with the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. And so that's a keyhole solution. Similarly, if you worry that immigrants will be bad voters, there is a keyhole solution to that as well. We already in the U.S., they cannot become citizens with voting rights for at least 5 years. And even then, they have to pass a civics test, which most native-born Americans would fail if they had to take it without studying. Britain and Canada have similar tests. In principle, you could make the 5-year period longer, you could make the test harder, and so forth, and those would be keyhole solutions for that. In the book, I present a wide range of these kind of keyhole solutions for many different problems, including for crime, for welfare state effects, for many other things. But let's say that there is a real problem and there isn't a keyhole solution which is likely to work. Then still you would ask the third question, which is, remember the vast new wealth that can be created by free migration. We can potentially tap some of that wealth and use it to alleviate negative side effects of migration itself. For instance, let's say you believe, contrary to evidence, contrary to most evidence at least, that there's a large number of native-born workers who are greatly harmed by competition from immigrants. If that is the case, and if you believe those people deserve compensation for that, then you can tax some of the wealth created by migration and use it for wage subsidies for that, whatever category of native-born workers you believe have been improperly shortchanged. In the U.S., we already have the so-called earned income tax program, which subsidizes the wages of the poor. You could potentially make that larger. You can key it to workers in particular industries, and so on. And there are similar tapping to wealth solutions for a wide range of other problems. One of my favorites is if you really believe that immigration is raising the crime rate, which is not, but let's say you believe that, simply by taking the money that the United States currently spends on ICE and other immigration enforcement agencies, and instead spending that money on hiring additional ordinary police officers, we could put many thousands of additional police officers in the streets. That would greatly reduce crime by both immigrants and natives. There's a lot of studies which show having more police on the streets reduces crime. And so that would be a sort of tapping the wealth approach to that particular problem. And I have similar ones for a wide range of others. Here, I'll just note one, which has been obviously in the news the last couple of years, the danger that migration will spread the COVID-19 virus or other dangerous diseases. And in fact, over the last couple of years, the U.S. was more closed to immigration than at any time ever in all of its history because of measures taken at least under pretext of fighting the COVID pandemic. I think my three-part framework works pretty well for this problem, even though obviously I designed the framework before it was in the public consciousness. We first ask, is this a real problem? I think obviously yes, the COVID pandemic is a real problem. On the other hand, it's far from clear that migration restrictions can actually address it. You will notice that despite the severe migration restrictions that the U.S., the UK, Canada, and other countries had during this period, they did not prevent the initial COVID-19 from getting in. They didn't prevent the Delta variant from getting in. Most recently, they didn't prevent Omicron from getting in. Indeed, they didn't even significantly slow the spread of any of those variants. So migration restrictions at best had a very minor beneficial effect here. So that may be a reason why, even if it is a problem, it's not one to which migration restrictions are the solution. But let's say you believe migration restrictions can be effective. Still, there are keyhole solutions which are likely better. One obvious one is simply adopt a quarantine policy. Say people can migrate in freely, but they have to be in quarantine for at least 5 days or 10 days or however many days public health authorities think is the right number. It seems to change. At least the CDC in the US keeps changing the number that they think is correct. But whatever number it is, you can potentially impose the quarantine. Alternatively, it is the case that with vaccination reduces the spread of the disease. You could instead impose the keyhole of people can enter freely, but they must be vaccinated. If they aren't already, they must accept vaccination by the border authorities. And either one of these or both in combination would be vastly better than the attempt to exclude. We gain all of the benefits of free migration. In addition, the attempt at exclusion creates a large population of undocumented or illegal immigrants, and that in turn helps spread the disease because, among other things, people who are undocumented are afraid of being deported, so they're unlikely to report for testing or to tell people that they have the disease if they do have it. And in addition, in order to enforce the immigration restrictions, you have immigration detention facilities, and those, the data suggests, are actually themselves spreaders of disease. They're very unsanitary. Both COVID and other diseases tend to spread there. And so I would add also that migration restrictions themselves, particularly in the long run, actually increase her vulnerability both to pandemics and other health problems, and that is because immigrants play a major role in scientific and medical innovation, and also in the medical treatment in both the US and Europe, including also here in the UK. They disproportionately contribute to scientific research. Both of the first two COVID-19 vaccines approved by US authorities, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, they were both developed either by people who were themselves immigrants from poor nations, or in the case of Pfizer, by a person who was the child of guest workers from Turkey in Germany. And if not for migration, we would still be in the throes of the pandemic much more than we actually are. But by keeping out as many people as we do, we have likely kept out people who would have made similar innovations and therefore actually made ourselves more vulnerable to various diseases, postponed the development of cures and vaccines and so forth. You could say maybe we should just let in only those people who the data suggests are likely to be medical innovators and keep out the rest. But governments are actually not very good at predicting who's going to do that. I mentioned any such criteria would have kept out the developers of these two vaccines, or in one case, their parents who are low-skilled guest workers. Therefore, in the long run and even in the medium term, the way to improve public health and health outcomes generally is actually to allow more migration rather than less. I would note lastly, with respect to all of these arguments against migration rights, while today they're mostly deployed against international migration, if you take them seriously, they could just as easily justify restrictions on internal migration. If you believe that the United States or Britain is a club that gets to exclude people, why can't England be a club that excludes the Scots or the Welsh? If you believe that we can keep foreigners from coming in because it might overburden the welfare state, well, I live in the state of Virginia. Right next to it is the much poorer state of West Virginia. Why shouldn't we be able to keep them out? If the West Virginians move to Virginia, they might overburden our welfare state, increase our crime rates, degrade our cultural values, and so forth. And almost every other argument that I mentioned, including, by the way, the spread of disease, it could be used to justify internal restrictions on migration, not just international ones. In the last part of the book, I talk about some institutional implications of the argument, both for the design of domestic constitutions and for international law. I won't go into this in great detail here, but I'm happy to talk about it in the questions. Internally, obviously, we want to have rights of freedom of movement, and there is a history of subnational governments in both the US and some other countries, either trying to keep their people from moving or trying to keep other others from moving in. We also want to decentralize power to lower levels of government so as to facilitate more foot voting opportunities. And there are various individual constitutional rights that can promote foot voting as well. I can talk about them in more detail in the questions. Internationally, one implication is that we should expand the definition of what counts as a refugee, that governments are not allowed to expel back to their country of origins. Currently, it's only limited to people who are being specifically targeted for persecution based on a few characteristics like political views, race, gender, ethnicity, and a few others. I think that can be expanded in various ways. On the other hand, we would like to avoid world government or strong forms of global governance because, of course, if you have a government for the entire world, that's one that you cannot foot vote against. You cannot migrate away, at least until there are space colonies, and that creates risks. In the worst case scenario, you could even have a global authoritarian or totalitarian state as envisioned by George Orwell in 1984. And I also discuss in that section of the book how we can have international cooperation to address the world's problems like global warming and others, but without forming the kind of strong world government that would make foot voting difficult or impossible. So much more can be said, and in fact, perhaps we will say some of it in the questions. Thank you so much.
So, I mean, putting my cards on the table, I mean, I very much agree with these arguments. I do agree with them quite strongly, actually. However, there's one of them where I think it's not entirely convincing. So it's the one about the enormous economic benefits that there are from free movement of people. It strikes me that even if that's true, the problem is that those people who actually oppose free movement might actually say we don't want those benefits. There are a lot of people in the world today who are saying they don't want more economic growth. They actually want, some people want degrowth. So saying to them, you can have all these benefits that you don't want necessarily, isn't entirely a convincing one. And likewise, I think there are people who, and I think this is certainly what happened in the UK with the Brexit referendum. There are people who value what they would see as being stability and not excessive change. And they would see large movements of people as being destabilizing. So what are the responses to that? I mean, I can anticipate one, which would be that, well, you have that within your country. But they're probably going to say it's not the same level of destabilization as if you get people from completely different parts of the world. So how do you respond to those two objections? The first one, which is that people don't want growth, and if people value stability, how do you give them that? I mean, my own argument would be you shouldn't want stability. You should want creative destruction. But it doesn't mean much to people who say they don't want that.
So there's in some ways, both the first and the second objection can be more than one type of objection because people might have different reasons why they don't want growth. And similarly, they might value different types of stability. Nonetheless, I do address a good deal of both of these kinds of arguments in chapter 6 of the book. I just didn't put them in the presentation because the presentation was too long already. So let's take people who say, we don't want growth. Today, to a large extent, those are mostly people on the political left who say things like, there's too much growth, it'll destroy the environment, or it'll only benefit sort of the wealthy capitalist class or something like that. Let's talk about the environment first, to which actually a section of my book is devoted, and actually a section of your book on robust political economy as well. I think we actually mostly agree on this issue. You can correct me if I'm wrong. That there's a lot of evidence which says having more economic growth actually improves environmental quality. Nations which are wealthier, on average, have less pollution, less mortality from environmental causes and the like. And something which greatly increases the world's wealth will likely also greatly reduce pollution. It will even make it possible to more easily address problems like global warming, which are global in scale, in that a wealthier world society can more easily, for example, example, enact a carbon tax so as to disincentivize the production of greenhouse gases and the like. Also, such a society will have more technological and scientific innovation. I mentioned before in the case of medical innovation, but it applies to other kinds of scientific innovation as well, in that a disproportionate percentage of our scientific innovators in the West have been either immigrants from poor nations or children thereof. If we have more people like that, we can have more technological breakthroughs, including ones that will benefit the environment. So far from environmental quality being in conflict with this kind of growth actually can promote environmental quality, and it can do so in a way that does not impoverish the poor in the process. So yes, we chemtrails, say, let's just reduce emissions by 50%, but if we do, or however large a percentage you think is necessary, but if we do that, that will impoverish a huge portion of the world. Whereas the path that I propose, and also Mark Pennington in his book, Robust Political Economy, where he has a section devoted to this, that can get us better environmental quality while simultaneously uplifting the poor rather than grinding them down. And that gets us to the question of the poor. When you look historically, the thing which has most uplifted the standards of living of the poor, both within the West and in the world as a whole, is in fact greater economic growth. That is why the working class in England, it has problems, but it's much better off than it was back when Friedrich Engels wrote the book of that title in the 1840s, is because of the vast economic growth that has occurred in England and indeed throughout the world during that time. Contrary to his predictions, instead of impoverishing the working class, that growth is probably the best thing that ever happened to them. On the issue of stability, I guess the question is what exactly it is that you want to be stabilized. If what you want to be stabilized is sort of the existing culture or something, then there can potentially be a keyhole solution in that you can say the immigrants can come, but within a certain period of time, they must learn the English language. You can even say they must become familiar with English culture or American culture, assuming the English or the Americans could agree on what the true American culture is. I would note also, as my colleague Brian Kaplan has pointed out, that Western culture is actually a hardy weed. Western popular culture is spread throughout the world. People are attracted to it. So I'm not actually greatly worried that Africans or Arabs or Latin America or Hispanics will come to the U.S. or to the UK but want to live the exact same culture as they had at home, because if that's what they wanted to do, they probably wouldn't come in the first place. But you can have keyholes to some degree to that, like requiring people to learn the language, pass a test of cultural competency and so forth. But ultimately, my answer might be similar to one that you gave, and that is that and I also give this answer in the book as well, that governments do not have the right to control the culture by force. We readily see this domestically, where what was really transformed the culture in many ways compared to what it was 50 years ago is in fact internal change. The new generation in some ways has a different culture than the older one, and so you have the stereotypical older person that perhaps I'm rapidly becoming myself, who says, oh, the kids are listening to terrible music and they have all the wrong values and, everything is terrible. But that doesn't mean that I should be able to use force to get them to listen to the music that I like or the cultural forms that I like or whatnot. And I think the same applies to international migration as to control of the younger generation. So if you believe that this is a legitimate function of government, there are keyhole solutions, at least to a large extent. If you believe, as I do, that for the most part it's not, then the answer is that just as you can't use repression of the native population to ensure this kind of stability, you can't have international repression as well. I do think there is a difference when the issue is not simply we just dislike this culture, but when the issue is that the culture has harmful illiberal values, like a homophobic culture or a culture that wants to repress women or something. I think however, there also are keyholes of the kind that I mentioned before. and also there are powerful assimilative mechanisms. One of my favorite examples of this is that if you look at survey data in the US for the last few years, the percentage of American Muslims who support same-sex marriage is pretty close to that of the general population, and actually higher than some mostly native-born groups like evangelical Christians. Obviously, most of the Muslim world itself is highly homophobic, but the Muslims who will come into the U.S., not all of them obviously, but a high percentage, they have assimilated to sort of Western liberal values. And this example about same-sex marriage is a particularly powerful one because it's so at odds with the traditional orientation of the places that they came from. And there are ways that we can make that assimilation even greater. The most obvious, opening up the labor market to people, which is a powerful assimilator, or others, some which I described in the book as well. That was a long answer, but that was two big, complicated questions.
Yeah, I've got some hands up now.
Foot voting is presented a little bit as a choice, a freedom of movement to choose to move to where you would like to live or like to be in an area where you'd like to be governed. But how does bounded rationality fit in with this? So if we're thinking about like actual displacement and migration, I mean, the choice is between staying in Darfur or going to Libya, not flying to the US. So in actuality, migration is a series of bounded rational choices as opposed to limitless freedom or, limitless foot voting. I said, so how does that fit in?
No. So it's a good question. Let me answer it in two ways. Some which of this is in the book. One is, even when you're fleeing from a desperate situation, if you have freer migration throughout the world, you can have multiple options. So if the U.S. and the UK and other Western nations were to drop their migration barriers, the people fleeing Darfur would not only be able to go to Libya, they could potentially go to a wide range of other places as well. That doesn't fully offset the fact that the situation in Darfur is terrible, and so it's not the same thing as just, I'm making a choice in a calm situation where I am is good, but I could choose something even better. But it does mean that it's not simply a matter of either Darfur or Libya, which is bad, but not quite as bad as Darfur. The second way that I would answer is that unfortunately, all human choice of any kind is limited to some degree. In a world of scarcity, there's no such thing as complete limitless choice. But expanding foot voting opportunities both greatly expands the range of choice compared to the status quo, and for the reasons I mentioned in the presentation, is often better than the choice that you have purely under ballot box voting. So it's not perfect, it's not completely limitless, but it's much, much better than the available alternatives.
20 years ago or so, a Swiss economist, Bruno Frey, came up with the idea of functional overlapping competing jurisdictions. And part of the appeal in that proposal was basically to unbundle the exit option from the need to actually migrate. Of course, that proposal didn't have a lot of practical success, but one may argue that part of the reason was that there was no technology for that kind of unbundling yet. And we may argue that in a way we're getting closer to that scenario with things like blockchain technologies and Ethereum that can maybe present an alternative to traditional lawmaking, traditional money policy, etc. So my question would be, do you think that that kind of scenario may actually reduce the incentive to migrate? And the second question would be, do you think that so do you see your intellectual project with this book as complementary to that idea of basically putting forward a way to fragment sovereignty in a way, or do you see that as an alternative idea to? You said you didn't want to characterize the argument as a libertarian argument, but of course there is that implication in the background.
Yeah, so it's a good question. For those who may not know, Bruno Frey is a well-known Swiss economist who proposed that instead of traditional territorially bounded governments, you could have sort of overlapping governmental jurisdictions and potentially people could choose between them without moving. So for instance, I live in Virginia. In theory, I could say, I want educational services run by the government of North Dakota, but I want police services run by Virginia. I want environmental policies run by New York and so forth. And in principle, I could choose that package without physically moving. I actually discuss Frey's ideas in chapter 2 of the book. I think to the extent they can be made to work, they are actually a form of foot voting, but with reduced moving costs. The way I define foot voting in the book does not necessarily require physical movement. It just requires being able to make a decisive choice. An individually decisive choice as opposed to ballot box voting, where your vote is just one of many millions, or many thousands at least. So in principle, you could have foot voting without physical movement. And Frey's idea, if implemented, would be a more expanded form of that. However, there are obviously some constraints, some recognized by Frey himself, other ones perhaps not. One is, it may be that some kinds of services have to be territorially bounded in some degree because they relate to the physical properties of the area. That might include things like security, environmental protection, and the like. Also, it may be that in some cases we want certain services to be provided by the same government rather by competing ones because of the danger of competing jurisdictions and the like. And also, being physically present in a particular location may sometimes be necessary for a variety of reasons I mentioned already in the case of work. So I'm somewhat skeptical, at least on current states of technology, that Frey's vision could be fully realized, but we can incrementally move towards it. I mentioned in the book some already existing examples, like, for instance, people who contract. Sometimes they can choose for their contract to be governed by the law of a jurisdiction other than the one that they actually live in. This is called choice of contract clauses, and there's some other examples of this as well. Maybe cryptocurrency to some degree can be an example of this. I don't know enough about it, I have to confess, to really be able to say. I know it's shocking that you have a libertarian that doesn't know anything about cryptocurrency, but I'm one such person, but potentially it could have that function. So I would say, to the extent that this system can work, it can be assimilated into my framework about foot voting. To the extent that it has limitations or it can't work, we can still rely on more conventional forms of foot voting of the kind that I talked about. So I think my argument goes true if Frey is correct, but it also goes true if he's mostly wrong.
Hi, thanks for sharing. I think my question is more about international immigration in general. As I understand, the international immigration is driven by the unevenness of global development. So if we have like a more open international immigration policy in the developed world, then you will have more people moving from like a developing country to the development world, and this development problem in the developing countries will be less likely to be tackled because all this talent have flow away from those like relatively poor countries. How do you address this problem? Will this more open immigration policy result in a reinforcement of inequality globally? And the second question, I guess, is more related to the sustainability of like a free movement. If as we know right now, we have this global production network. Like it's like people in the developing countries or poor countries or supply a lot of stuff to the developed countries. And if you have all these people moving from those countries to the others more developed world, then how are we going to sustain this production network or like global value chain in like the scholarly term? Thank you.
Sure. So there's two interesting questions there, one of which I address at some length in the book, which is the first question about the effects of potential brain drain. Then there's the second question, which I don't address in the book, but it's somewhat easier. So the second question says, well, if people who are currently producing things for sale to the developed world, that if they moved from where they currently are, who would produce those, the sneakers that we wear in the first world, or the other kinds of goods? And I think the answer is primarily that if these people move to the developing world, they'll actually be more productive than before. So they could potentially produce similar things, but at higher wages because they'd be more productive. Or alternatively, there would be other people who could produce it because there would be more wealth available to pay them and more resource available and so forth. So I think a change which actually makes people more productive, we don't need to worry too much that it will actually reduce productivity. If anything, it'll have the opposite effect. That's the whole point of it, or at least that's a big part of the point of it. The first question is one that is more often raised as an objection to free migration rights, and I have two levels of responses to it, which I develop in the book. One is sort of a moral or ethical response, and that is, let's say that the argument is true that if certain talented people leave Africa, for example, or leave North Korea or wherever, then that will harm the economy of their home country. I will still say that it is still morally wrong to force them to stay for that purpose because these people are not owned by the government of their country. They're not owned by the other members of the population, and therefore they have a right to seek out opportunity, even if that means there will be less wealth as a result for people in their home country. This is especially true if, as in most cases, it is in fact the injustices and corruption of the government of their home country, which is one of the reasons why that country is as poor and relatively unproductive as it is. So if you go the other way, then the argument is not just that you should be able to force the person to stay, but even perhaps that the government should be able to dictate what profession they enter and the like. After all, if the argument is, well, you must stay, say, in Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe needs engineers, and if you go to England, then you won't be able to be an engineer in Zimbabwe. Well, the same argument could be used to say, you may want to be an artist rather than an engineer, but what we really need for the development of Zimbabwe is more engineers. We're going to make you be an engineer because artists don't add to our productivity and development as much as engineers do. Second sort of more practical response is that in fact the migration can benefit the sending nation in two ways. One is immigrants who move to wealthier nations, but they have relatives still back home, so they send back remittances, many of them, that is money that they send to their families at home. In a country like El Salvador, for example, which has a large diaspora in the US and Canada, some 25% of GDP actually consists of remittances sent back by immigrants. Moreover, the second effect is more questionable than the first, but it's there to some degree. There's evidence that if you have a country which has a large diaspora in freer, wealthier societies, that can facilitate the flow of ideas back home and lead to more liberalization. There are studies of Central America and India and some other places which suggest effects like this. But ultimately, I would say that what we want is not the development of particular places, but the development of people. So if many people leave Haiti or leave Cuba or whatnot, in fact, a high proportion of all the people in the world who are of Haitian or Cuban descent now actually live in the US or in other countries, that means much greater average wealth for Haitian and Cuban descended people, even if Haiti and Cuba themselves remain poor. There's a similar effect, you can say, for Ireland. There's many more Irish descended people in the US, Canada, and Australia than Ireland itself. And even though for a time, Ireland didn't grow and develop that much. Today is actually highly successful, but in the late 19th, early 20th century, not so much. Still, this was an enormous boon for actual Irish people, and ultimately we should care about the development of successive people more than we care about the development of places. So the very fact that fewer people have to live in places where they are condemned to poverty and to oppression, that's a good thing even if the place itself doesn't improve or doesn't improve as fast as we would want.
I wonder if you could explain the distinction between what you take to be a political choice and a personal choice. So a personal choice might have profound impact on your life. Your opportunities are expanded. And then it's really clear that international migration expands your range of personal opportunities. But I think of a political choice as a choice that has an impact on the laws and the political institutions, on potentially public opinion. And then moving internationally as an individual seems a little like casting a vote. You as an individual are going to have minuscule power to change the laws of the government you're moving to. And some of your examples do look like a political choice, like moving to a small community. Your vote has more of an impact. But the international migration, it seems to be, it's justified on the grounds that your personal opportunities are expanded. But politically, it just looks a little bit like the ballot box.
Yeah. So if you define a political choice as purely a choice that has an effect of actually changing laws or changing government policies in a particular place, then it's true the overwhelming majority of us are condemned to powerlessness no matter what system we have, unless we're like the king or the president or a dictator. By king, I mean a king in a country where the monarch actually still rules as opposed to having symbolic power like here in the UK. However, what I mean by a political choice in this book, and I don't think it's a purely idiosyncratic usage, is your ability to control what kinds of government policies you live under. And there, foot voting has tremendous advantages, in many cases at least, over ballot box voting, in that if I move from Virginia to West Virginia, or vice versa, I can live under a different set of policies. If I move from Russia to the United States, which I actually did with my parents when I was a child, there was a much bigger change than that from Virginia to West Virginia and so forth. And you might say, and some people do say, well, it's not really a political choice, as many people who are moving, they're moving for the purposes of improving their job opportunities and the like. But that, of course, is heavily affected by government policy. So I maintain it's a political choice if the reason why you move is one that is significantly affected by government policies. I don't claim all moves are like that. Like there are some moves which are driven purely by the weather, right? That there's evidence which says that people like warmer weather and they move to, I personally am not like this, but the data suggests that on average people are. So one reason why people move to Florida is, Americans at least, is because, Florida has warmer weather that I don't especially like, but that many people do like. So that I would say is not a political choice. On the other hand, if you move to Florida because there are better job opportunities, that is significantly affected by government policy. And obviously that's even more the case if you're moving to the U.S. because you're being oppressed in the country where you lived in, or in the case I mentioned earlier, women moved to Wyoming because Wyoming offered women more in the way of equality and rights than eastern states did, and there's many other examples like that. So I think it's a good question. I think that's really my answer.
Hello. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask, and this might be a very strange question, that how do you address the idea of ideological domination? Because how I see it is that the problems of global north are different from the problems of global south. At least, for instance, the example of India, in which many Rohingya refugees migrated to Assam, and then the problem was that because they were Muslims, so they were probably going to vote for Muslim leaders, and then there was a problem that the government was Hindu majority. So the exclusion started to happen because of the very reason that they realized that we should not integrate them. We should expel them because we need to remain as a majority, as an ideological domination. And this is a very common problem in global south. Many countries are religious countries or autocratic countries, which is different to maybe in the global north, where perhaps some libertarian principles overlap. So how do you address that? Because as I see it, the arguments make sense for if we try to separate these two worlds, but the problems at that area are quite different.
So they may be a little bit less different than you're suggesting, in that, as I alluded to earlier, a standard objection to migration offered by many people is that the immigrants will have terrible political views. So as a result, they will vote in leaders who advance terrible policies. In the extreme case, the policies might be so bad that they will kill the goose that laid the golden egg, and therefore, instead of the immigrants enjoying the better institutions of the new nation or the new state or region, they will turn that location back into the kind of hellhole that they were fleeing. And of course, this can take the form of saying, well, we can't let in Muslim immigrants because they'll dominate the Hindus, as is said in some parts of India. We can't let in Latin Americans; they'll dominate the native-born sort of Anglo-white Americans, and so on. And in the book, I address these problems at all three kinds of levels. And remember the three-part framework. So you first ask, how big a problem is this really? In many places, it's not actually much of a problem because the political views of immigrants and natives don't differ nearly as much as is often claimed. That's certainly true in the U.S. In addition, recent immigrants are less likely to vote than long-term residents, and there's an even bigger gap in terms of other forms of political participation. You might regard this as a bad thing if you think political participation is good in general, or if you think that immigrants might move the political system in a good direction. But if you're worried that they'll move it in a bad direction, that's actually, their lower levels of participation are actually a good thing. And in addition, there's what scholars call status quo bias. That is that people are reluctant to make big changes in existing institutions. That also works to tamp down these kinds of effects. But let's say and I would add also that in order for migration to have a big impact on the political system, there have to be both a pretty large absolute number of immigrants, and they have to skew heavily in one direction. Because let's say, for instance, immigration increases the population of an American state by 10%, and the immigrants split 60-40 between one political party versus another. Still, because they're only 10% of the population, that's only actually a 2-point net shift in favor of that party, and that assumes that immigrants vote at the same rate as natives, which they typically will not. And so on. But let's say you believe this is a bigger effect than I've just painted. Then you have the keyhole solutions I mentioned already. You can delay the time at which the immigrants get the right to vote. You can say they only get the right to vote if they pass certain kinds of civics tests or whatnot. And so on. You can also have constitutional safeguards against certain kinds of discriminatory government policies, including those that discriminate against Hindus or Muslims, which I know India, at least in principle, already has, but obviously not perfectly enforced. So there's a variety of different kinds of keyhole policies of that kind. Ultimately, at this point, is a bit beyond the scope of this book, but ultimately what we should aim for is a political system and a constitutional structure which is robust such that it does not, in fact, rely on having a majority of a particular racial or ethnic or religious group. It should be one which can function reasonably well, whether the majority is made up of whites or blacks, or Hindus or Muslims, or Christians or Jews, and so on. But obviously that last point is something that would require a book of its own. Obviously people have written books on this, but I think this objection is raised in both the North and the South, if you want to call them that, and I think the same kinds of responses, broadly speaking at least, apply in both situations.
I have a question actually just related to the last one, which is when I hear the answers like that, I find them very convincing. But there's an aspect to them which sounds, in a sense, they sound quite technocratic in a way, that if you're talking about a keyhole solution, it sounds like a very technocratic kind of view where, okay, we see there's a problem there and you just sort of plug in a variable to deal with it. But you're dealing with what are, and this is one of the reasons why we have the movement of people in the first place, governance structures that are highly imperfect, that are often very fragile. So do we have any confidence that the structures will actually be able to implement things like a keyhole solution?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I perhaps should have explicitly talked about the technocratic aspect in the book, but I do mention more obliquely what I will say more clearly now, which is that pretty much all of the keyholes that I go through in the books are in fact ones that have clear analogs in existing government policies in the US and in many European countries. We already have the 5-year rule for becoming a citizen and the civics test. The test could be better. I've written pieces, not in the book, but also on how the test could be improved. But it's not something that's so super complicated that only like the most brilliant possible technocrats could run it. It's actually pretty simple. Similarly, the idea of spending less money on the border patrol and spending more money on the police, that's not actually that complicated. We increase expenditures on the police all the time. The idea of subsidizing the wages of native-born workers who are suffering from competition, well, we already have the earned income tax credit system. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the UK and European countries have some similar policies to the earned income tax credit. So it's not something that's so complex that or so new that it requires like brilliant technocrats to do. It's true, it may be that what the question was asking for an Indian state like Assam, which has a more dysfunctional government, maybe it's less able to do these things. On the other hand, the worse the status quo institutions are, the harder it is to argue that they're so valuable that we have to preserve them for the kinds of stability that you were talking about earlier, that we might want stability of really good institutions, stability of sort of kind of cruddy institutions, excuse the phrase. I'm not saying that's worthless because they could be even worse, right? You could have, you could have worse than cruddy institutions, but the worse the initial institutions are, the weaker the argument for keeping them stable.
Yes.
Anyway, thanks a lot for the presentation. It's really interesting. One question, it seems to me that in a setting like, US states, where there is some feedback between foot voting and ballot voting, it looks to me that the premise under which, the fact that foot voting would lead to better outcome is that we are more informed when we take that decision with respect to ballot voting. So, wouldn't we get to the same results if we were able to inform more citizens when they vote for the ballot? So, what is the difference in a world where you have freedom, or a set of autarchies with perfect voters?
So it's an interesting question, one that I actually take up in greater detail, not so much in this book, but in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, where I talk about how one possible solution to the problem of political ignorance is let's just have voters that know more. But then I also sort of throw cold water on it in that the ideas that people have offered to do this, for the most part, at least so far, haven't worked very well. For instance, the average American and the average UK citizen as well has several years more formal education than their predecessors 50 or 60 years ago, but political knowledge levels have stayed pretty flat throughout that time. And there are other proposals people have for increasing political knowledge, but for the most part, they haven't worked out too well either. On the other hand, foot voting is a mechanism that we already know when people vote with their feet, they become better informed. There's lots and lots of evidence of that. That's true even for people who are poorly educated, who have limited cognitive ability and so on. So it's at least so even if ideally we could achieve many of the same results if we had a fully or well-informed electorate, we don't know how to create that well-informed electorate, at least not yet, whereas we do know how to empower people to vote with their feet. Even in the world with the fully informed electorate, you would still have the problem of the inability to make an individually decisive choice, and that would still be a significant moral problem, even though the policy consequences would be less grave because the quality of government policy would be higher.
I'm wondering if an implication of your theory is that the more similar the laws are between countries, the less the choice to move will impact the laws under which you're governed. I don't think that's a bad implication, But alternatively, the more different laws are between countries, the more being able to move gives you an extra option.
Yeah, I think that's right. If the alternatives before you are all exactly the same or almost the same, then the freedom of choice would be less valuable. Ideally, you would have something more of a competitive market so that if the choices are all the same, but there's a potential for improvement, then there will be incentives to generate that. But yes, if you can imagine a world where of homogenous or nearly homogenous options, then foot voting of the kind that I'm talking about would not have much value, or any value maybe. You might still move because you like the climate or for family reasons or for other kinds of reasons that are unrelated to government policy. But at this point, we're not in much danger of having this completely homogenous world, or even a world where all American states are homogenous. They obviously are not, and on some points, like abortion, they may be diverging more rather than becoming more similar. So I'll worry about that problem at some point in the far future if it turns out that that actually occurs. So we're waiting for the mic, I guess.
Any thoughts on charter cities?
Yeah, I talk about that a little bit in the book. For those who may not know, charter cities are the idea of sort of setting up a new jurisdiction with new laws such that potentially instead of making it easier for, say, Guatemalans to move to the U.S., there's this project to try to set up a new city in Guatemala, which is governed by its own, hopefully better laws, and which will offer Guatemalans, a good alternative close to home. I'm not against charter cities where it's politically feasible. I say go ahead and do it. But I think it's not a replacement for increasing foot voting opportunities for a couple reasons. One is setting up new charter cities in many cases are probably politically impossible because the governments of those countries won't let them be set up, at least not unless you go to war, which presumably few charter city advocates actually advocate let's invade Guatemala and force them to allow the establishment of a charter city. Second, even if you can set them up, it'll take a long time for the city to get going, to become an attractive alternative and so forth. And for many millions of people, they can't wait. It would be good for them to have foot voting opportunities right now. Finally, even when the cities are up and running, even if they're pretty good, they won't necessarily be the right or the best option for everybody. And those other people should have, other alternatives, just like even if you set up the most ideal possible university or educational institution like King's College, I know it's shocking, but it might not be the best possible university for everybody, even if it's the best that could possibly be imagined as a general rule. So, people should still have the opportunity to apply to other institutions if that's what they want to do. So I'm in favor of charter cities, but I think there are big obstacles to them, and I think they're not a replacement for what I advocate here. They might be a complement in that when we have more charter cities, it would be more, they could be among the potential foot voting opportunities that people have.
Okay, I think we've given Ilya a good going over for the questions from the audience, but we do have some refreshments at the back of the room. So if you'd like to carry on the conversation with him, we do have him for another half an hour or so. So please do join us for that. And I'd just like to say thank you all for coming to the event. It's nice to see you all here. And thanks very much to our speaker, Ilya. And please do, if you haven't thought about getting it, get the book, Free to Move. So thank you very much, Ilya.
Thank you. I should note that 50% of all royalties generated by this book go to causes benefiting refugees.